This is Tom Kozlik, the head of public policy and municipal strategy at Hilltop Securities. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for this new episode of our Hilltop Talks Politics and Finance podcast series for 2024. During these Hilltop Talks podcast discussions, we speak with subject matter experts about topics that intersect the worlds of politics and finance at the federal, state, and local levels in the U.S. We often concentrate on issues related to U.S. public finance and the U.S. municipal bond market. Today's episode is the 6th for 2024, and I want to welcome Jeff Previdi, who is the Vice Chair of GASB, or the Governmental Accounting Standards Board. Thanks so much for joining us today, Jeff.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
I know Jeff going back to his time at S&P, where I worked with him when he was an analyst and manager in the housing and tax-backed sectors. Jeff, before we get into the specifics about what you're working on day to day, and I am very much looking forward to talking about the Financial Data Transparency Act of 2022 and GASB's projects like the Infrastructure Asset Project and GASB's Going Concern Uncertainties and Severe Financial Stress Project. But before we get into those themes, I wanted to give our listeners a little bit of background about GASB, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the background of the GASB board for the folks who are listening to our podcast today.
Sure, Tom. Actually, GASB has been around now for 40 years. This is actually our 40th anniversary year. And so what GASB does is we make generally accepted accounting principles for state and local governments in the U.S. So your listeners may be familiar with FASB, or the Financial Accounting Standards Board. They're our sister board. We're in the same building, and we do the same thing they do for corporates. We do that for governments. And so our board is comprised of 7 members, and I'm in the second of 2 5-year terms. And I come to the board not as a CPA, not as an accountant, but rather, as you said, Tom, my background is as a user of financial statements. And so as a muni bond analyst, I sure looked at, as I know you did, Tom, a whole lot of financial statements. And it's in that experience of working with financial statements and how they're used, that's what the board is interested in. So each board member brings sort of a different perspective. We have state and local preparers, so the governments that are preparing financial statements, we have 2 people with that background on our board. We have 2 people from auditing at the state government level and the local government level. And then we also have a public auditor, and we have an academic on the board as well. So each person brings their vast experiences and backgrounds and sort of to help create and maintain our generally accepted accounting principles.
So you don't have the accounting background. How is it that you fit into that picture and your role as vice chair? I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, sure. So again, that's correct. I don't have that CPA or accounting background. Now, of course, I've actually had to look at a lot of financial statements. And as part of my role, we have a lot of expertise at the board and staff as far as accounting and their expertise. Again, what they're looking for is the perspective of those who use financial statements. How will this information be valuable to them? How will it be used? Similarly, as I said, go ahead.
Like investors.
Like investors or citizen groups, right down to the citizens. We have, a pretty wide view of who constitutes a user of financial statements. And if you think about it, we have 3 big, stakeholder groups. One is the preparers, or the governments themselves. Those entities are preparing financial statements. We have the auditors, those that audit those financial statements, and then the users. And the board tries its best, and I know what an effort we put in to balancing all of those needs and coming out with outcomes that really balance the effort it takes to prepare those financial statements with the benefits that are received from the users who consume them. And then, because of my background as a user of financial statements, the board, I think it was a year after I joined the board, made me vice chair, which provides me with more of a platform to do outreach for the board. And my outreach I do are things like this, Tom, to reach out to those user groups and people who are not as familiar with the GASB process, are not as aware of how they can provide input, to encourage them to provide input. And I hope I can speak today. And when I speak in a language that's, not accounting speak, not intimidating, but rather in language they understand, and they realize that, hey, there's a role for me. I can provide input and help the GASB, create better accounting statements.
Well, there are the three things that I mentioned that I'd like to discuss a little bit with you today. The first thing is something that I've written about a little bit over the last 2-ish years. I know that our listeners on the investor side and on the public entity side, this is an ongoing topic that they've been concerned about. And I was wondering if you could tell our listeners a little bit about GASB's role in the implementation of the Financial Data Transparency Act of 2022.
Sure, Tom. Sounds like your listeners are familiar with it, and it's obviously been a topic of great interest. So this whole idea of what we call electronic financial reporting has been a topic that's long been of interest to GASB, because our interest is in the reliability of GAAP, no matter how financial information is consumed, right? And for a long time, we've been believing that the old way that you and I, Tom, consumed financial information back when we were working together was typically paper. And then it's become things like PDFs, but everybody believes that, okay, we should be moving into a world, right, of machine readable information. And so the GASB's been thinking about that for a long time. Ultimately, of course, under FDTA, it's the SEC that's going to decide what information gets machine readable, whether it will be financial statements. Everybody thinks financial statements will be part of that, whether it'll be the entire financial statement or not. But our goal is to make sure that, as far as what we do, right, which is create standards for state and local government financial statements, we want to make sure that information, no matter how it's consumed, is accurate and complete. So how have we done that? We've begun work on creating our own GASB GAAP taxonomy, right? And so, not to get into too much of the technical details, because I'm not a technical person, right? But the taxonomy is a way for machines to be able to interpret information more accurately, right? So if you think about it in terms of a spreadsheet, right, within each cell, information is embedded that tells the computer that, hey, this information is in thousands, it's as of this date, it involves this calculation, these sorts of things. And so what GASB is doing is something similar to that, and embedding the accounting rules that are behind the numbers that you see when you look at a financial statement. And so being able to create that, right, basically for anybody, right? So we're just creating it so that it can be used by the marketplace, however they want to use it, right? But as far as it relates to that GASB GAAP information, that information will be true to the accounting standards that we have created, right? So ultimately, we're agnostic as to the technology that gets used, right, Tom? You hear about XBRL, which is used on the corporate side, or whether it'll be some form of AI or machine learning models. For us, we don't really care what the outcome is. What we want to make sure is, no matter what technology is being used, this taxonomy would be available so that accounting information can be accurate and complete.
And so what portions of the financial reporting is GASB doing that taxonomy for?
Well, it's interesting, right? Because part of what we believe, right, and you'll get a sense as we, have our conversation, right, is, we believe a lot of what we do at the GASB, right, is subject to a lot of rigor, a lot of due process, a lot of stakeholder input, right? So we believe what we have in our current requirements for financial reporting that information has stood the test. That we have heard from the users of financial statements the value that they place on that information, and that the burden is reasonable for governments to endure. And so for us, the portions of the financial report that we're creating the taxonomy for are the entire thing. So not just the financial statements, not just the notes to the financial statements, but also required supplementary information and supplementary information. So that complete set of information, in other words, what users have access to today, they should have access to in this new world of consuming information.
So next week there's an XBRL US municipal reporting workshop that's going to be taking place, and as you just mentioned, we're not yet certain about how it is that the output is going to be structured. Maybe that's the easiest way to put it. What are the bigger themes? And I should mention also that as part of that workshop, TJ Sheehy and Managing Director from Hilltop Securities is going to be participating on a panel titled Professional. It's called the Professional Services Panel that Emily Brock from the GFOA is moderating. But in looking through the agenda of this workshop, what is it that you think are going to end up being the main themes and or takeaway for GASB from that kind of day and a half conversation?
Well, I mean, there's lots of big themes here, right, Tom? And certainly you'll see at that, conference, the ongoing discussions of the burdens that governments will face through any requirements that are enacted under FDTA, particularly smaller governments, which is always a concern, and certainly something that GASB is mindful of when we're doing accounting standard setting. So that's going to be an issue, but also some other issues, Tom, that I think may get some attention are, I'm talking about, because this is our domain as GAAP, right, or generally accepted accounting principles, those who issue their financial statements under GAAP. But as you know, Tom, there's a lot of governments in the U.S. that issue debt that their financial statements are not done under GAAP. Right. So there's questions about, okay, how is that information going to be overseen, and who's gonna create whatever taxonomies are going to be created. So there's an issue there. And then another issue that I think is part of ongoing discussions is what's called legal entity identifiers. Right. So this idea of when you're looking at financial information, whose financial information are you looking for? And of course, on the corporate side, I think that's a little bit more straightforward, right? Because they don't have some of the complexities that we have and you're familiar with, right, Tom, in the municipal market, where you might have a city, a large city that could be issuing debt under half dozen or more different programs. And when you're analyzing those programs, when you want information on those programs, you want information on the program.
Right.
You don't want information, just general information or aggregated information for the city, right? So how this notion of a legal entity identifier, that is, how are users going to enter into this system and say, it's not City of Chicago that I'm interested in, it's City of Chicago schools that I'm interested in, right? And being able to break it down further. I think these are some of the issues that, as folks think about it more within the municipal space, these are things that are going to have to be hammered out over time.
Yeah, before I shift to ask about your infrastructure asset project, I'm also going to highlight that on day 2 of that conference, Joel Black, the GASB chair, and Dave Sanchez from the director of the Office of Municipal Securities at the ACC are going to have I guess I'd call that an open discussion or a panel discussion about this as well. I wanted to highlight that for our listeners as well.
Yeah, thanks,
also.
Tom. Yeah, that's right, because obviously, as mentioned, right, the SEC is going to be deciding what happens, and Joel and Dave have been having ongoing discussions, and GASB's goal is to be as helpful as we can, however we can, in the realm of what information the SEC ultimately decides needs to be submitted in machine readable form.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'd like to shift it to discuss the infrastructure asset project, and I wanted to also highlight to the folks who are listening that for both the infrastructure asset project and the going concern uncertainty and severe financial stress project, there is information on the GASB website. There's a tab that's titled a project or projects, and you can look specifically at these topics at the GASB website if you're looking for more information after we discuss this. But Jeff, I was wondering if you could tell us about the infrastructure asset project and explain the information need GASB is trying to meet with this project specifically.
Sure, Tom, and thanks for the call out to the
Yeah,
GASB website. We just made it new and improved and easier to navigate. So
it is
hopefully,
easier.
when you get
It is
on
easier.
there,
Yep.
and you'll hear my call to arms, right, to get people to participate and engage with us. And so, getting familiar with the website is great. So the infrastructure asset project really came about as a result of research GASB did with regards to capital assets. Whenever GASB thinks about undertaking a significant standard-setting project, we typically do a lot of research in advance to sort of get a shape of what the situation is now. What sort of improvements do our stakeholders think could be made? And we did that with capital assets because capital assets, as you remember, going back, Tom, first arrived on government financial statements through GASB 34, which was issued way back in 1999. And so we went out and did a lot of research with regards to capital assets to find out how our stakeholders thought the guidance was working. And by and large, we got pretty good feedback that it was working pretty well, except one area that folks seemed to think could have improvements was the area of infrastructure assets.
Okay.
And, it's not surprising, right, Tom, because you hear a lot about infrastructure, particularly in the municipal bond analytic community. I think there are those who are concerned that one of the ways governments can balance their budget may be to reduce the amount of money they're spending on their infrastructure. And when we see sometimes high profile, infrastructure failures, I think these sorts of things sort of get people concerned that, gee, is my government or our governments or is government I own the bond for not spending as much as their infrastructure as they should. This whole notion of deferred maintenance.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where the board decided a project should arise. And so we've commenced our deliberations on infrastructure assets with the goal to improve the current guidance that we have and hopefully make information more comparable, more useful, more relevant to the economic condition of those assets, and better reflect the capacity of the assets to provide service. So just as background, Tom, for your listeners, right, there's really two ways governments reflect capital assets, in particular infrastructure assets now. One is historical cost. So you have the historical cost, and then you depreciate that historical cost over the estimated useful life of the asset. And the other way it can be done is through what's called the modified approach. So if a government decides that they're going to preserve an asset at a certain condition level for as long as they can, right, they don't have to depreciate the asset. What they do instead is have condition assessments made for those assets, decide on a condition level, and then disclose, okay, what do they need to spend on that asset to maintain it at that condition level, and then disclose what they actually spent on that asset to maintain it at that condition level. So by doing that, they give the user, right, insight into, are they spending what they need to spend to maintain that asset at that particular condition level. So if they do that, that's an option for the historical cost and depreciation. Now, most governments do historical cost and depreciation, but that is how currently infrastructure is accounted for. So that's sort of the background for the project.
So, how will the governments be asked to provide the information that you're looking for? Is there going to be additional information that they're going to need to include?
Yeah. So as I was just describing how what we call recognition and measurement are being done
Hmm.
today, I think with the board's deliberations thus far, I think our tentative decisions, right, are to keep those two ways of recognizing and measuring infrastructure assets,
Hmm.
but providing information. One area that I think is the board is focusing on is the area of disclosure,
Okay.
and perhaps having increased disclosures about their government's infrastructure assets, thereby giving users of financial statements more insight into what governments are doing to maintain their infrastructure assets.
So would that fall into the category of kind of the change in this project? That's going to be the specific improvement that's kind of being that's under consideration from GASB's perspective.
Yeah, so I think when we think about, so I'll give you a couple examples of
Hmm.
things the board is thinking about for improved disclosures.
Okay.
For example, one would be a breakout of maintenance expenses.
Okay.
So right now, the amount of money that governments use to maintain their infrastructure is currently included in a line item with a whole lot of other expenses for a whole lot of other things.
Hmm.
So there's not clarity, right, in terms of what the government is actually spending to maintain their infrastructure assets. So I think when the board comes out with its initial proposal, which, by the way, should be before year end,
Okay.
that will
Before the
come
end of this
out
year.
with
Okay.
our what's called preliminary view.
Hmm.
That in that preliminary view, there's going to be some recommendations that there be a breakout of maintenance expenses. And
Okay.
I think this can help users in two ways, Tom. One is that now users can see what governments are spending on their infrastructure assets broken out by major class of assets. So roads and bridges could be a major class of assets.
Hmm.
Water sewer could be a major class of assets, right? Electrical utilities could be a major class of assets. And so users could see the breakout of what the government is expending to maintain those assets. And that disclosure would be over time, right? So users of financial statements could see, what is government A spending over time? Is their spend on maintenance increasing? Is it decreasing? Why is it increasing or decreasing? That's one benefit. And another benefit is to be able to compare across governments, right? So if I'm looking at two governments that may have similar infrastructure assets, I can now see, what is government A spending on maintaining its infrastructure assets versus what is government B? And what is that telling me, right? Is one spending more than the other? Why is one spending more than the other, right? So I get a sense of this idea of, are they spending enough, right? So it gives the user more ability to dig in, to ask questions, to be able to find out that information. Another example of something that we're considering additional disclosures for was the notion of estimated useful lives.
Hmm.
So when GASB 34 was started, governments decided, okay, here's the estimated useful lives for my various types of assets. And I think in the research that we did, we sort of got the sense that for a lot of governments, that was sort of set it and forget it. And what we found through our research is there are a lot of infrastructure assets currently being used that are past their estimated useful life. So that means, well, we're not sure what that means, right? But one of the things I think you can expect a proposal to include is to have governments annually reassess their estimated useful lives and make any changes that they feel are necessary. That
Hmm.
is, obviously things change on the ground, and we recognize that. And so if an estimated useful life should be longer than they initially estimated, then they should change that estimated useful life, right? So that those expenses that are being allocated through depreciation are being actually allocated over the entire useful life of the asset. Another potential disclosure will be of the historical cost of those assets that are fully depreciated. So that users of financial statements can now know, wow, gosh, this government has a lot of assets that are past their estimated useful life. What does that mean? Might that mean, future capital borrowing is going to become necessary? Might that mean, future near-term capital expenses to maintain this infrastructure that's past its useful life is going to be necessary? So we think that sort of information, right, will enable users to get at these questions they have about how governments are maintaining their infrastructure assets.
Okay. So another ongoing project that I wanted to ask about is GASB's Going Concern Uncertainties and Severe Financial Stress project. I'm interested to know, this one, for example, I'm interested to know when it began, and I'm also interested to know what the difference between the Going Concern Uncertainty and Severe Financial Stress is, as far as your project is concerned.
Yeah, so this is a project, another project I imagine will be of interest to a lot of your listeners, Tom. This is a project we've been working on for a little bit. It's sort of at a similar stage as the infrastructure asset project in that we're working on our initial due process document, which will be a preliminary view. And this was really, I think, one of the drivers for this, Tom, was sort of some of the more recent municipal bankruptcies that have happened, right? Because for those of you, maybe less familiar with the accounting, right? But this notion of a going concern opinion, right, is a pretty old accounting notion, right? And that is that there's an opinion by it's usually in the opinion letter that the entity has some probability likelihood, like say probable, that it will be unable to continue as a going concern for, say 1 year after the financial statement date. And this is typically done in the corporate world, right? And what it typically suggests, Tom, is that, there may be bankruptcy in the offing, that there's really severe financial difficulties for those companies. But what does it mean in the governmental context, right? And so, as you know, Tom, some of these high-profile municipal distress events we've had, and indeed bankruptcy, the entity continued. Right? Because those services that those entities provide are vital for their communities. And so what does this notion of a going concern opinion mean in the municipal space? So after that research, the board decided that, a project was necessary to undertake that. And so what we're doing to create this difference, right, is the board, at least in our initial deliberations, is separating these two notions. So going concern uncertainty will still be that, right? There is an uncertainty and there'll be a probability threshold, something like it is probable that the entity will be unable to continue as the same legally separate entity for a period of time after the date of the financial statements. So there's a notion of, there's a threshold to be broached in a period of time. And then that is regardless of financial condition. And then there is this other notion of severe financial stress, which, as we know, for a lot of governments that get into stress and in states that don't permit their local governments to go to bankruptcy, severe financial stress in the board's mind is a current condition, right? So that's an important notion. So severe financial stress, you are in severe financial stress for purposes of what we're creating here, versus going concern uncertainty is there is a likelihood threshold that you will cease to be a going concern after a certain period of time. So what the board is working on is defining what does going concern uncertainty mean, right? And what we're settling on is this idea of ceasing to exist as the same legally separate entity. And that could be for could be financial reasons, right? Could be bankruptcy. There could be a small special district out there that heads into bankruptcy and then dissolves afterwards. But it could also be for things like mergers and acquisitions. So back when I was a muni bond analyst, I had one of my governments was being merged with another government, right? And so it was in the name of efficiency and good government, but that entity was going to cease to exist. And did that have potential credit ramifications? It did. right? So this idea of going concern uncertainties can come about from any source, be it financial or merger acquisition. And then the flip side, also creating a definition of what severe financial stress is.
Mm-hmm.
And what the board is heading towards is an idea of near or at insolvency.
Mm-hmm.
So insolvency, pretty understood. And I would think this is also going to be a standard about disclosures that one may say, well, insolvency, maybe that's too late. And the board would agree, which is why we've added this term near or at insolvency. So how near gets described, how near gets understood is going to be very, very important, I feel, to the value of these disclosures ultimately.
Mm-hmm.
So once we get these descriptions, and in each case, we're going to provide within the standard, in case of going concern, relevant factors for governments to consider as they come to this decision. And for severe financial stress, we're going to provide indicators for them to evaluate. Not an exhaustive list by any means, because there's going to be professional judgment involved, but things that they can think about as they decide whether or not they're in this condition. And if they decide there are, then there's going to be required disclosures for them to make about what caused the situation and what are they doing, what mitigants are they pursuing to rectify it.
So how does GASB determine if users are finding this information valuable?
Well, that's a very good and important question, Tom, right? Because as we talk about, one of the things the board strives to do is derive a cost, provide a benefit cost calculation for the standards that we do. That is, mm-hmm. we try to ascertain from users what the benefit is of the information that we're going to provide, and understand from the preparers and auditors what's going to be the burden or cost to preparing it, right? So what we're doing in the case of the Going Concern project, and we're doing it also in the infrastructure asset project, is even before we get to our proposal stage, before we put it out for comment, the board deliberates and decides, hey, here are what we think of are some pretty sound disclosures that might be very helpful to users. But then we actually go out and talk to users. We actually go out and do surveys. We interview significant numbers of users to hear about, hey, if you had this disclosure, because now these are oftentimes not disclosures that are currently available, but if you had this disclosure, would you use it? Mm-hmm. And how would you use it? And we go to various different types of users, because within our conceptual framework that we follow, one of the things we have to determine as a board in order for a note to become a note to the financial statements is that we view it as essential for users. And how do we determine essentiality? We determine essentiality by trying to determine that it will have a meaningful effect on users' analyses, and that it will be used by a depth and breadth of users. So that's what this user outreach does, to try to give the board a sense of how users are going to use it, what types of users, what different types of users are going to use it, all for us to determine, hey, we think it's essential. And then it'll go out for in our preliminary view, and we'll get, obviously, through that process, further feedback about it.
So it sounds like there is a formal process that you're going through. Are there other in informal ways or other ways for users, folks that are listening now, maybe they want to share opinions with you and GASB about these or other topics? Like, what are the best ways for folks to share information with you?
There's lots of ways, Tom. So we, as I talked about, both of the infrastructure asset and the going concern projects, they're both going to have these preliminary views documents out before year end. And it's super important, really, at this early stage, because this is the first document in each case we're going out with, that input is super important, right? Because I know as a board member, we review all of the input that we get, and that can come in the form of comment letters that you send to the GASB. We also have an electronic form that's linked within each of our exposure documents. so that you can click in there and there are going to be questions. You don't have to answer all of them if you don't want to, but there are questions on the different aspects within the proposal. And so you can provide your feedback that way. And there's even other ways that you can get involved with GASB because, we oftentimes will appoint task forces to each of our projects. And so this is going to be a group of folks from different backgrounds who agree to assist us and the staff as the staff puts together the proposals for board review. They share it with the task force, and the task force provides feedback that the staff then shares with the board, all of which is designed to get the notion, right, that I don't have all the expertise, right, Tom, in terms of all of these issues that we're working on. So what I rely upon is hearing from others, hearing from our stakeholders. And, if to the extent I hear good ideas, that I'm gonna take those ideas and advocate for them. But all the good ideas don't reside solely in my head, right? So that user input, that other stakeholder input, so important to us as we work on our standards.
Okay. Yeah, I think, thanks very much for going into detail about these projects, what it is that you and the folks at GASB have been working on. I'm getting the sense, at least hopefully, that this is going to help connect these different, a combination of the users and the providers. So thanks very much for talking with us today, Jeff. I appreciate that.
Sure thing, Tom. And I'll give one more plug before
Please.
we go to
GASB,
GASB.org, right? Where if your listeners are interested in anything that we talked about, they can certainly find out more about them, and they could also get to me through that website, and be always willing to talk to folks and get them more engaged in the GASB process.
Great. When I post this podcast on social media, I'll make sure that I include links to those projects from your website as well.
Okay, terrific.
Great. Well, thanks again, Jeff. And thanks very much to all those who tuned in and downloaded our recording today. We really appreciate you listening. For those interested, you can also see recent Hilltop Securities economic and municipal commentary and listen to our podcasts by going to hilltopsecurities.com/commentary. And you can follow me on Twitter and LinkedIn. Thanks, everyone. We look forward to bringing you more color in the future related to topics that intersect the world of politics, finance, and public finance. This has been Tom Kozlik from Hilltop Securities.